everyone. Thank you again for joining us for another episode of the Lackawanna Historical Society's Lackawanna Pastime Series. I'm Sarah Puccini, the Assistant Director of the Society. Thank you for joining us on what is here a lovely day. Our presenter for today is Alan Dietrich Ward. Alan is an environmental and urban historian with a focus on political ecology and community development. He has earned acclaim for teaching, professional service, scholarship, including the Arlene Custer Memorial Award from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference for Beyond Rust, Metropolitan Pittsburgh and the Fate of Industrial America, which was published in 2016 by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Alan is currently a professor of history and the director of the graduate school at Shippensburg University. I first met Alan when he was serving as president of the Pennsylvania Historical Association, where I'm still a council member. Alan is also on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Humanities Council and also active in the conservation community and community development communities, serving on the board of the Cumberland Valley Rails to Trail Council and the steering committee of the Pennsylvania Conservation Heritage Committee, among other organizations. Alan's going to be talking about his new book that will be coming out the end of September, Cradle of Conservation, looking at environmental history in Pennsylvania. So, Alan, I'll turn it over to you.
Sarah, I am so delighted to be here. I hardly ever get to see you or Marianne for that matter. And so getting to do it at least virtually more than the once a year, I generally see you at the Pennsylvania Historical Association meeting is an absolute a delight. Thank you everyone for inviting me. You may regret this decision by the time we're done. My new book, Cradle of Conservation and Environmental History of Pennsylvania, is coming out. It's Amazon official, so you can pre-order it on Amazon. It'll be out in September, and this is my very first book talk for it. So you get what you pay for in this case, and I'll look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts as we go through. I am planning on taking about 45 minutes. I know it's an hour session, so I want to take 45 minutes, kind of hit some key ideas from the book and from the broader Pennsylvania environmental history. And then make sure that I leave time for you folks. Environmental and conservation history of Pennsylvania is a topic that many people feel passionate about, and everyone has their favorite place to talk about in Pennsylvania. And so I'm really eager to open it up and hear everyone's, kind of get a sense of everyone's thoughts about the Pennsylvania landscape. This is Joseph Rothrock, and he is standing on a rock outcropping on South Mountain, just about maybe 20 miles from where I am here in Shippensburg. I don't know his beagle's name, so if you want me to make something up, I will, but I don't. So don't you scratch that off your questions list. Joseph Rothrock is widely considered the father of Pennsylvania forestry, and I kind of put him up here to get started with because when I moved to Pennsylvania back in 2006, one of the first things that really struck me about this state was just the beauty and the multitude of public lands. If you are from Pennsylvania, I have found that folks oftentimes tend to not understand what a gift from the previous generations the public lands in Pennsylvania are. They are something to be cherished and to be loved. And in many ways, that was the start of this book project. My first book, as Sarah mentioned, was on Pittsburgh specifically. And by the time I got finished with that book, I really wanted to kind of think about Pennsylvania as a whole and see where, where does the history that I had with Pittsburgh fit into that broader notion of Pennsylvania as a whole. The Pennsylvania Historical Association sort of agreed to let me take that on, and I've made a lot of friends over the ensuing years, both in environmental historians and others interested in Pennsylvania's history, as well as in present-day conservationists really thinking about how we use this legacy of public lands to think about our future. And I wanted to kind of start the conversation today by thinking about the notion of working landscapes, right? So oftentimes when we think of environmentalism or environmentalists, or we think of preserving or preserving land, we think of these kind of great big, kind of untouched expanses. And Pennsylvania doesn't have very many of those, right? Pennsylvania's landscapes have been loved and oftentimes loved to death. And the notion of a landscape that is not some sort of place that is far and distant and away and separate from humanity, but a landscape that is the lived landscape in which people work, in which they play, in which they're active. That really is the starting point for this. And in this, I've spent a lot of time thinking about working landscapes throughout the state. And in this, I'm joined by your hometown hero up there in Lackawanna Valley, Bill Conlog. This is an excerpt from his book that came out at about the same time as mine did, and the ways in which kind of the meaning of working landscapes that combine both the physical space and our societal attitudes toward that space, the ways in which we use that space and often misuse that space over generations. You can read that landscape in just the same way that we read a book or we read a manuscript. You can really read that landscape over time to get a sense of what the societies that created it really valued, how they thought of themselves, how they thought of each other, and how they thought of the physical world. And so that really became the starting point for this, kind of this notion on the one hand of public lands that are set aside for future generations, but also knowing that those public lands often came out of a sense of the destruction of the natural world by humans, and the need to figure out what is that balance between use of resources and misuse of resources. So I'm going to take about another 35, 40 minutes or so and talk about these working landscapes, right? These Pennsylvania landscapes as they evolved over the course of the last 300 or so years. Trying to tackle all of Pennsylvania's history throughout the entire state is a very daunting project. This book is only about a third as long as my first book, and it was probably harder to write. As anyone who's sat down to write something knows, in some ways it's actually easier to write more than it is to write less. And figuring out how to go about doing that when talking about places that people knew very well and that they often loved was very difficult for me. I got to the end of this book and I realized that I had not mentioned Centralia. I got to the end of this book and realized that I had accidentally cut out every mention of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So it's been a long process of figuring out what can be done in the space that it is, and really thinking carefully about how to tell the story that I really think needs to be told. So I'm going to divide this up into about 5 pieces. Thinking about the ways in which the landscape is shaped and reshaped, thinking about the ways in which we see an early conservation movement emerge, think about then what we think of now or know now as the environmental movement, and then the contemporary world. And what I want you to keep in mind are the ways in which these landscape changes, they stack on each other, right? They don't just go away. They're not just replaced by later people or later years. They sort of stack on each other. And they then, of course, shape the way in which subsequent generations go about using those landscapes. Okay, so Pennsylvania is really marked, I think, in comparison to surrounding states by its diversity of landscapes, and particularly by the ways in which the Appalachian Mountains and the various river systems that we have really pull the state and its people in different directions. And that's been a real defining sort of quest of this book, is to think about the ways in which, on the one hand, we're dealing with sort of very different geographies, very different climates. Anyone who has spent a winter up in Williamsport versus spending a winter in Chambersburg knows that Pennsylvania it's very different, very different countries. And thinking about the ways in which kind of the geography, the physical environment pulls people apart, but also knowing that political boundaries make a big difference. And so they simultaneously kind of pull people together. Thinking about the ways in which those two variables shape and structure the state of Pennsylvania is a real key variable that I talk about in the book. I'm not going to talk about it as much here because of time constraints, but that's something that's kind of a key question that I ask, and particularly in comparison, to New York, right? New York has a relatively similar geography, a relatively similar long-term history, but it doesn't have nearly the barriers to east and west transportation that Pennsylvania has. And so New York and Pennsylvania become this really interesting kind of comparative study that I explore as the book goes on. Of course, New York doesn't have nearly the coal, oil, and natural gas that we have in Pennsylvania either. And so that history of fossil fuel extraction, kind of creates a different experience between Pennsylvania and New York City. So if you want to learn more about that, buy the book. I will talk more about it. I will talk more about it there. So Pennsylvania has some of the longest, deepest history of anywhere in North America. If you have ever been out to Meadowcroft Rock Shelter outside of Pittsburgh, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter kind of reshaped the way in which historians and anthropologists think about the evolution of Native American peoples in the country. It pushed back by 8 to 10,000 years the understanding of how long indigenous peoples have been here. During that time, the biggest changes in the working landscapes of native peoples were the slow retreat of the glaciers, which lowered the sea level, or sorry, excuse me, dramatically raised the sea level. Much of the earliest settlements of native peoples in Pennsylvania are now 10, 15, 20 miles off the east coast of America. As this process happens, as the weather warms, we see the gradual slow importation of agriculture from the Southwest. This then really creates kind of these earliest agricultural working landscapes in the state, and it really differentiates, much like we're going to see later on with Europeans. You see very different groups of people kind of settling and evolving over the course of thousands of years in different parts of Pennsylvania. In broad terms, we see folks in the Ohio River Valley to the west. We see folks in the Susquehanna River Valley from New York down through Pennsylvania. And then we see the Algonquin peoples, the Lenni Lenape, kind of the coastal areas to the south and to the east. Now, it's really important to remember that there is this really long history of native peoples that happens before Europeans arrive at all. And we see some of the very kind of biggest changes in native life that happen even before they meet, Europeans begin to extend into the interior of the state. And that is the introduction of and spread of these epidemic diseases that kind of reshuffle, kill enormous numbers of people, reshuffle the population. We also see it at the same time, a long period of warfare, particularly between the Iroquoian or the Haudenosaunee people that we used to refer to as Iroquoian, and the Algonquin-speaking peoples, as the former are really looking to control the beaver pelt trade with Europeans. And so there are really at least two generations of historical change in Pennsylvania in the 100 years before William Penn sort of has his settlement. So the arrival of Europeans, it really sort of involves two broad sets of issues. The first is that these are peoples that are mobile, right? Europeans have not lived in, have not balanced themselves with the natural world for multiple generations in the ways that native peoples had. They don't have the same sense of spiritual connection. But this lack of a stable community, I think, is probably even more important. This then also leads into kind of the other major change that we see Europeans bringing in their relationship with the natural world, and that is this broader transatlantic marketplace, right? So suddenly goods, natural resources that may have only limited value in the place where they exist get involved in this much bigger transatlantic trade that provides and gives them a value as they are transported elsewhere, right? And we can see this both in terms of agricultural goods, a shift toward farming that, even though much of it is sort of sustenance-based, just like with Native Americans, another portion of it is kind of extracted and sent, whether to the Caribbean, whether to the growing East Coast cities or wherever, right? So if we look at the ways in which kind of the interior of Pennsylvania change, they're really transformed by this arrival of these new groups of people who are looking to increase their wealth through this broader transatlantic trading system. Okay. Very early on, of course, it's not just rural environments that we see, right? But it's also urban environments. William Penn famously establishes Philadelphia as a green country town. It is this ideal community that he and his followers set out. And Penn is really influenced by a series of catastrophes in London shortly before he began his colony, and particularly epidemic disease, and particularly also a major fire that we see in London, right? And so, Penn, in establishing this green country town, has this idyllic vision of the ways in which the community is going to function. That doesn't last very long. Those parks and community squares that Penn establishes in the original plan, they very quickly become garbage dumps and squatters' spaces. In that, sort of the early creeks, Dock Creek, for example, here's sort of an early depiction of Dock Creek. By the time we get to the 1750s and 1760s, Benjamin Franklin is complaining about the terrible odors and the death of all of the fish in Dock Creek, where he lives, where his print shop is near, because of all the tanneries and other industrial effluents that end up in Dock Creek. So in many, if you've seen Pennsylvania sort of depicts Franklin as this first environmentalist, that's because, with his estate, he leaves money for cleaning up the water, which again has become so rank already by his time that it's poisonous, right? So I wanted to be sure, as we're kind of thinking through these early working landscapes in Pennsylvania, to just draw our attention very quickly to the Wyoming Valley, right? This is a depiction, sort of an idealized depiction of the Romantic, the Hudson River School painter Jasper Francis Cropsey from 1865. You can see all of the different elements of these transformed working landscapes that I've been talking about if you take a close look, right? These are river-oriented communities. Even by this time, agriculture has kind of assumed this, bucolic frame. It was a lot messier than that, I should note, than is depicted in this. But in the backgrounds, you see the smoke and fire of early industrialization, as well as of iron and charcoal works in the background, right? So even as we're sort of exploring this development of working landscapes in Pennsylvania more broadly, they're very clearly depicted in northeastern Pennsylvania and the Wyoming Valley as well. Okay, you guys good with me so far? So again, it's movie to get through everything. So I'll take a quick breath and move on. All right. So the creation of these very quintessential Pennsylvania landscapes that we associate with the Industrial Revolution really begin to take shape in the early 19th century. And they are guided, as I hinted earlier on in my talk, by a revolution in transportation, right? There are only so many, when you have a riverine society that uses water for your main source of bulk transportation, there are only so many rivers that flow into each other in the mountainous terrain that is Pennsylvania, right? And so very quickly, European colonists, seek to sort of transcend those rivers, to build other mechanisms by which you can move goods. Roads are an early development here. We see the first macadammed, kind of cobblestone road, physical road that's the turnpike between Philadelphia and Lancaster that gets built in the late 18th century. We see the evolution of canal building early on here in Pennsylvania. However, there's a limit to this transportation revolution in Pennsylvania that is going to shape it really all the way through to today. I live in the Cumberland Valley. I know that if I want to go northeast to southwest, I can be there lickety split. If I want to go any other direction, then I have to either go up over top of a mountain one way or the other, or I have to drive around it. So as the crow flies means very, very little in Pennsylvania, as you all know. The inability of Pennsylvanians to compete with New York City, which has this sort of natural break in the Appalachian Mountains in the Mohawk Valley, even with Pennsylvania sort of building its canals, building the mainline canal system, New York City really takes over as the dominant city in the United States during the early 19th century, because you simply can't get from Philadelphia anywhere else very quickly, right? And of course, the other piece of this too is that because of the geography of the state, much of the state is oriented away from Philadelphia. Pittsburgh is much more oriented toward the south and the west, towards growing cities like Cincinnati or even St. Louis. Here in the Cumberland Valley, it is very, very much easier for me to go down the Susquehanna River and get to Baltimore and the Chesapeake Bay than it is to go around to get to Philadelphia. So what you see, unlike New York City, which really becomes this kind of has this really strong connection to Chicago and the West and the Midwest, Philadelphia really focuses much more on its immediate hinterland, which is a great hinterland, right? There's great agriculture in Lancaster County and Philadelphia's hinterland, but this is really this moment when Philadelphia and New York's fortunes split. Okay. Following on the heels and connected very tightly in with this transportation revolution is the development of what we kind of later on call heavy industry, right? Early on, the way in which iron and steel are made is much more of a rural enterprise. It is much harder to it's much easier to transport finished goods, but they're much lighter than it is to transport raw resources. And so until we see this transportation revolution, iron making is really out in the countryside, where you have these kind of very large tree farms that produce the charcoal that's necessary to fire the forges. By the time we get to 1830, 1840, 1850, the use of anthracite coal, which you guys all know very, very well, and the ability to transport that coal down to Philadelphia, to other cities, really shifts industrialization and the Industrial Revolution to becoming much more of an urban phenomenon. That's not the same for every industry everywhere, of course, right? But industrialization does go hand in hand with the development of mill towns, with the development of urban environments. And of course, when you centralize these sort of pollution-causing industries and pack them all really tightly together, you have obviously environmental consequences to that, as well as social consequences. And I want to take just a quick moment to sort of emphasize something that you all know very, very well in the Wyoming Valley. But another theme of the book is the ways in which the attempt to dominate the natural world, right? The attempt to extract resources from the natural world goes hand in hand with the attempt to dominate and exploit other human beings, right? And so what we see here is an economic pattern that even as it creates enormous wealth through natural resource extraction and through natural resource use, oftentimes shunting off pollution and other environmental consequences onto the public at large. So the benefits, the wealth is private, the consequences are public oftentimes. So too do we see that in the social world as well, right? With the with the domination of labor, right? So this gets us in many ways, with my very short sort of quick overview, this gets us to that kind of high industrial period of the late 19th century. And what's interesting to me, and this is what I think is absolutely fascinating, and something that formed a key element in my book, are the ways in which the very people who benefited from this particular way of extracting wealth from natural resources also become the very people who start to question the social and environmental consequences of that industrialization, right? So let me introduce you to a few of them. This is a picture from 1908. The new state capitol had just been completed. This office is still there. in the Capitol building. And this is the first two classes of foresters, of trained foresters, who had graduated from the new Mont Alto School of Forestry, the Pennsylvania School of Forestry, which was only the second school of forestry in the United States of America, right? You'll notice, of course, that nearly everyone in the room has a particular complexion and has a particular gender, right? So let me draw your attention to three people. Joseph Rothrock is there, sitting at the table, the same guy with the beagle and the rifle that we saw on top of Pulpit Rock at the beginning, of course. The father of forestry has to be in that room, right? But we also see the mother of forestry, one of my favorite people in the history of Pennsylvania. Her name's Myra Lloyd Dock. She's the one with the hat, you might guess. And Myra Lloyd Dock is really, really important to this story because we oftentimes think of the conservation movement as being something that's about trees, it's about woods, it's about rural areas, it's about logging. Myra Lloyd Dock is actually first known as an urban activist. She's from Harrisburg. If you've ever been to Harrisburg and you've seen the lovely kind of riverfront park along the Susquehanna River, Myra Lloyd Dock almost single-handedly created that, right? She was an absolutely fierce and tireless advocate for urban reform, for what a movement that becomes known as City Beautiful. She's known on the national level for her work. She's also a trained botanist. She, in middle age, after her mother died and she basically raised her father and her siblings, she went to the University of Michigan, where her brother had gone and studied botany. And really became famous throughout Pennsylvania through lantern slides, where she would tour around and talk about botany. She then transformed that sort of, kind of lovely talk about flowers into a force for social and urban and environmental reform. Myra Lloyd Dock was the first woman to hold any political office in the state of Pennsylvania, appointed or elected. She was also the very first forestry commissioner, female forestry commissioner in the world. Myra Lloyd Dock. So let me point to one other person in the room here, and he is the guy standing right behind Myra Lloyd Dock with a darker complexion. This is Ralph Brock. He was a protege of Joseph Rothrock, who noticed his real aptitude when he was in high school in Westchester, where Rothrock lived. And he really took Brock under his wing and encouraged him. Brock was in the first class of graduates from the Mont Alto Forestry School. He is the first African-American trained forester in the world, right? And his experience is an interesting one. You have to read the book to get more, just because of time. But in many ways, the book is called Cradle of Conservation as an homage to Ralph Brock, who, even as a student, was put in charge of the nursery at the Mont Alto Forestry School. And that forestry school really is kind of the living embodiment of the way in which Pennsylvania plays this leadership role in the conservation movement. So the reason I point these out to you is because, sort of in a movement that is dominated by white men, here in Pennsylvania, from the very beginning, people of color and women played a central role in conservation in Pennsylvania. Without spending too much time, I want to emphasize again, Myra Lloyd Dock really underscores to us the ways in which urban beautification, and I use that a little bit in quotes because there are a whole lot of negative consequences that come with urban beautification that we'll see some of in the 1960s. Urban renewal, urban beautification, urban conservation, and the fight for a more equitable distribution of access to natural resources and to a good environment. This really originates in this movement in the late 19th century that we call the progressive movement. And there are aspects of it, again, led by women, led by people of color, that are going to carry us all the way through the environmental justice movements of today. They are really hand in glove with what we think of as the conservation movement, the rural conservation movement, that is about public ownership of state forests, right? So in the 1890s, Rothrock and his advocates, many of whom are urban socialites from Philadelphia. In many ways, the Pennsylvania forestry movement, as much as it gets associated with Rothrock, is actually the political motivation behind it actually comes from urban women in Philadelphia, many of whose families had grown enormously wealthy from natural resource extraction, then turning around to say, how are we going to preserve? How are we going to protect? How are we going to continue to generate a useful environment for our children and their children, that legacy, right? So we see in the early 20th century then this increasing connection between the need for natural resource protection, the need for natural resource extraction over a long period of time, right? What we might think of as a sustainable model for the economy. That really develops beginning in the 1880s and 1890s, and then in many ways reaches its culmination in the New Deal of the 1940s, where it becomes very, very clear that the way in which the landscape has been used and abused is going to no longer make the ability for economic success possible, right? And one of the places that we can see this is the way in which flooding throughout Pennsylvania. This is a picture. I know this flood very well. This is the Great St. Patrick's Day flood of 1936. You can see similar pictures of downtowns underwater, whether you're looking at Wheeling, West Virginia, whether you're looking at Pittsburgh, whether you're looking at Johnstown. Roosevelt just came to Scranton. So, that's important, right? So, what we see here then is this alignment of this conservation movement with political power of the New Deal and the desire to, again, continue reshaping the natural world to serve the needs of the contemporary world. This sort of, again, reaches its, we see an alignment in which environmental conservation is no longer simply a private thing, but becomes increasingly a part of the public sphere. Of course, the Civilian Conservation Corps and much of the environmental work that the Roosevelt administration did had its precursors here in Pennsylvania. I don't have a ton of time to talk about it, but Gifford Pinchot, that great conservationist, he had his second term as Pennsylvania governor in the early 1930s. He put people to work chopping firewood and building roads. That became the model for his friend Roosevelt's Public Works Administration and Civilian Conservation Corps. So we see the overlap, I should say, the leadership of Pennsylvania as a conservation state leading into the New Deal. Okay, so in the 13, 14, 15 minutes I have left, let's start talking about the ways in which we see a transformation into the contemporary world. In many ways, the conservationist movement really was focused on the production side, on preserving natural resources over the long term, right? And that, Pinchot has this sort of famous phrase, the best use of resources for the longest time, right? But really a focus on production and a focus on the natural world as being first and foremost subservient to human needs, right? And I think in my mind, you can kind of see this in when we see flood control and flood protection, right? The big seawalls, the big concrete, you guys know this very well in Wilkes-Barre and Scranton, the big kind of concrete ways in which the rivers are channeled. You don't really think of that as an environmentalist sort of approach to, to managing the environment, right? That is really about how do we go about using technology to continue to control the natural world and to protect humans, right? In the post-war period, we see this broad shift to thinking about the natural world and natural resources, not just in terms of production, but also in terms of what we might think of as quality of life as consumers, right? We think of, in the post-war period, these hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who, with federal loan guarantees and new highways, moved from the cities or moved from the farms into these new suburban tracts like we see here in Levittown in 1952. The promise that these folks are made, right? The promise that they are made is that the suburbs will allow both the conveniences of modern life, right? The urban amenities, while also providing a clean and healthy environment for kids to grow up in, right? That's really the promise, when you think of the leafy suburbs, right? However, when you start putting tens of thousands of septic tanks, right, or you put tens of thousands of homes in which the community sewer system is nowhere near designed for that, very quickly the problems of the cities follow people out into the suburbs, right? And so we see this real movement in the 1950s and 60s, this kind of slow evolution of conservationism into what we now call environmentalism. Pennsylvania really leads the charge for this. And we can see this particularly in the work of Maurice Goddard, who is standing in the background here with Governor George Leader. Goddard takes over what was then the Department of Forests and Waters, really starts out as he's a conservationist. But if we think of the earliest period of progressive natural resource conservation as being focused on state forests, right? In many ways, the post-war period shifts the attention to state parks, right? That is, how can we protect the natural world for the long-term health, right, and quality of life for Pennsylvanians? In the 1960s, time after time, Pennsylvania residents vote for bond issues. They vote for increases in protection for the natural world. And this really transcends Republicans and Democrats, right? We see this real push toward conservation and toward protection of resources for, again, human use, yeah, but a use that is not confined to just making sure that there will still be trees to harvest 50 years from now, right? And so we have a number of bond issues in this regard. The most kind of famous of them is called Project 70. And much of the state parkland that we have in Pennsylvania today, some of the biggest parks, all come from this time period of the 60s, in which Goddard argued for policies that would ensure that there was a state park within 25 miles of every Pennsylvanian. Goddard really serves as this kind of transitional figure in that he comes out of this earlier conservation movement, but as he is holding the position of Department of Forests and Waters, another really important, the most famous Pennsylvania environmentalist, Rachel Carson, publishes her book Silent Spring, which argues that functionally that conservation isn't enough, right? Simply, seeing natural resources as being needed to protect for human use is no longer enough. Carson really emphasizes the notion of ecology, the notion that there are all of these links that are oftentimes not fully understood between humans and the rest of nature. And we see out of her work and the work of other Pennsylvanians the evolution of this environmental movement, even in Scranton, right? I cannot understate this evolution between about 1968 and about 1972, in which environmental concerns, a whole range of environmental concerns, dominate national politics, of course, at a time when the war in Vietnam is also doing that, right? And we see this slew, both in Pennsylvania and on the federal level, of this enormous attention toward environmental issues and enormous popular support for environmental regulation and protection. Pennsylvania really leads the way on this. You can see, many of you may be familiar with the Environmental Rights Amendment that's passed in Pennsylvania in 1970. The originator of that, his name is Franklin Curry. He was a rep and then a senator from Sunbury. He kind of famously jokes that the Environmental Rights Amendment and the other ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, are on the ballot at the same time. These initiatives on the ballot at the same time. And the Environmental Rights Amendment passes 4-1, while the Equal Rights Amendment only passes 2-1 in Pennsylvania, right? So we have that level of support, really rural, urban, and suburban for environmental issues. And I just want to pause and let that sink in for a moment at a time when sort of environmentalism and environmental protection have become much more polarized and have become much more associated with particular kinds of people in particular places in Pennsylvania, you really do see this widespread focus on natural resource protection here in Pennsylvania that doesn't, I wouldn't say it fully transcends all geographies and all political persuasions, but it certainly has adherents all across the state and all across the political spectrum. Okay, so then bad things start to happen. No, the eagle's good. The eagle's a good thing, right? I don't want to suggest that, right? But then the 1970s are a very troubling and difficult time for the state of Pennsylvania, right? Sort of at this moment when quality of life issues, environmental protection really come to the forefront of Pennsylvania politics. The end of the Vietnam War, the drawdown of military contracts, and sort of other bigger political issues, including OPEC, create a period of economic instability in Pennsylvania. Now, this isn't a sudden break. We sort of see a broad transition of Pennsylvania's economy over previous decades. But you see it beginning in the mid to late 70s and then sort of really culminating in the collapse of the steel industry between about 78 and 85. You see this major shift in employment throughout Pennsylvania. You see this major outflow of workers and their families from places like Scranton. At exactly kind of the same time in which the environmental movement is pushing for more health and environmental-based regulations. This is a moment, though, when many of the things that we have now become accustomed to in Pennsylvania, like the notion that, yeah, there really are bald eagles in Pennsylvania, right? Yeah, we really can trust that our drinking water is safe, right? Yeah, we really can go fishing in these streams, right? This that legacy of today of this cleaner, healthier environment really has its origins at exactly this moment, right? And so what we see in the 70s and 80s is at the same time as Pennsylvania's kind of physical environment is improving, I guess you might say in some ways the cultural environment casts environmental protection as increasingly polarized, right? And those two things kind of, over the past 40 years have influenced a lot of what has happened in the state of Pennsylvania, right? So this is one of the kind of the key pictures I have from the book itself, the Palmerton plant from New Jersey Zinc Company. What to do with these industrial production sites that are no longer active production sites really dominates the conversation, certainly in urban Pennsylvania, but in many places throughout the state since the 1980s and 1990s, right? As I said, I really started my work in thinking about Pennsylvania's working landscapes and looking at Pittsburgh. And this becomes a really halting process of how to go about ensuring environmental justice for those who have traditionally been left out of environmental amenities, social justice for workers, for families when industries close, combined with questions about what to do with these industrial landscapes when they're no longer actively producing in the way that they had. How can these landscapes be transformed to serve the needs of people today, right? And I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing and talking about this. I was just at the Pennsylvania Downtowns Conference in York on Tuesday, talking about heritage and trail-led economic development in communities. And so when we think about the ways in which our working landscapes of today build from the working landscapes of the past, that to me is some of the most interesting things as Pennsylvanians that really we can be doing. We love our places. How do we go about ensuring that the places that we love can continue to inspire, can continue to perform an economic and a social function, for coming generations? Obviously, I'm kind of ending the book with one of the key elements that have happened over the last 15 years in Pennsylvania, and that is Pennsylvania is resurgence as an energy capital. When we began the 21st century, coal was the dominant form of electrical production here in Pennsylvania, with the notion that perhaps renewables would slowly over time take over from coal as the dominant form of electrical production, particularly in the face of global warming. We all know that that is not exactly the trajectory that's happened in Pennsylvania over the last 15 years. The ability to harness new forms of extraction technologies, which has resulted in the fracking revolution for natural gas and oil, I think continues to underscore the ways in which the diversity of landscapes here in Pennsylvania makes Pennsylvania a really good stand-in for the rest of the country. You know, unlike our neighbor to the north, New York, where you have this diversity of landscapes, but you don't have nearly the level of fossil fuels that you have in Pennsylvania. And you also have a downstream municipal area in the form of New York City that can kind of dominate the politics of New York State in a way that Philadelphia might want to, but certainly can't in the rest of Pennsylvania. This creates a dynamic that I think is actually much closer to the national story and to the national dynamic with both energy producers and energy consumers, with people both upstream and people downstream, with people in rural and suburban areas and people in urban areas, all sort of, trying to figure out how to inhabit a shared landscape, oftentimes with very different goals or needs in how to use that landscape, to kind of sustain their lives and livelihoods. So I wanted to leave you all with just talking about this last piece. I would guess that many of you had the experience of either finding or refinding some of your favorite landscapes, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, when our lives were disrupted. We desperately wanted to get outdoors, desperately wanted to be able to interact with other people, but also were limited in our ways to do so. I hope, as someone who's really involved with the Rails to Trails community, I know that our users of the Cumberland Valley Rail Trail, where I'm on the Trail Council, just shot up. There were people that had never been on the rail trail before that fell in love with it during the pandemic. It really did become the town, Shippensburg's town square. My hope is that something good can come out of this period of real darkness in our nation and in our state's history. If we can rediscover our love for these shared spaces and figure out how to come together as a community, local, state community, to preserve and protect and maintain those resources. That for me is kind of the real goal of writing this book. Again, it really comes out of my experiences, I think, in rediscovering some of those places that I love during that really difficult time. So there it is, 46 and a half minutes. Not too bad, not too bad. I think that'll leave us some time to chat. Here's shameless plug for the book. I'll turn things back over to you, Sarah, if you want to have a conversation.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ellen. That was great. I will put the pre-sale link for your book in the chat in a few minutes. I'm glad you mentioned the philanthropic women in Philadelphia who were tied into the early conservation movement.
Yep.
They pop up in Scranton as well. They're all over. They were City Beautiful women.
Yep.
One of them, Grace Weston, she has two parks in Scranton that were donated by she and her husband. Grace was also a botanist who has, I think it's a species of orchid named for her, either an orchid or a camellia. I'm not sure. But she was, heavily involved in that movement as well. Because so much of Pennsylvania's history was extractive and gross and awful. It's great that so much of it now is coming back to be used for conservation. The rail trail systems. I know our friend Troy Watkins is here, and he talks a lot about when he was growing up how awful and gross the Lackawanna River was and how far away you could smell it. And now that same river is trophy trout waters in a lot of sections. That's been cleaned up, makes use of the mine outfall of very cold water, which apparently trout really like. And there's trophy trout waters in that river that was so awful and so gross. So it's great that there's that kind of resurgence coming back. If anybody else has any questions, I was muting people when we started.
Mhm.
So if you have anything to add, please unmute yourself and chime in.
Yeah, I'm really happy you mentioned that, Sarah. And in fact, one of those two women that really, more than anyone else, really get the Pennsylvania Forestry Association and get Joseph Rothrock sort of transformed from a kind of a local guy who gave talks into the father of forestry. Has a strong connection to your neck of the woods. Maria Cox is Eckley Miners Village is named after her brother-in-law, right? The Cox family, who made their wealth, very prominent Philadelphia family, but made their wealth off of Trench Cox, the Revolutionary War founding father, investing in a big chunk of what he just knew was going to be really lucrative coal land up in northeastern Pennsylvania. The same family, the same money that creates that sort of landscape, shall we say, is the same family that then becomes the originators of the conservation movement to restore that land.
Yeah, it's great that it's carrying over. Ruth, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for this talk. It's so interesting. And I just want to make sure that I got what you were saying about the transition in the 70s or after the 70s, because of the economic problems, that conservation became more of a political issue. Is that correct? And how has that changed over time? Is it more of a political issue? Has it been kind of a straight line? How would you characterize it?
Sure. So many of I guess one way I could put it is this way: the progressive movement, which is the origins of conservation, it's not exclusively a Republican movement, but it's certainly the most of the advocates of it in Pennsylvania are Republicans, right? I mean, they're urban Republicans like Gifford Pinchot, or like Joseph Rothrock, so if we think of conservation as a movement, the progressive era conservation movement, it is a Republican movement, right? And because it's focused on basically long-term, it's focused on economic growth, but the need to control that economic growth so that it is sustainable. So to make a book short, or a long story short, yes, what we see, it is the shift from conservation support to the support for what we think of as the environmental movement. If we have to tag that to a particular moment in time, and I don't want to overstate this, but I'm giving you sort of a very simple version of thinking about it. In the 1968 legislative session, the Democrats take back the Pennsylvania House for the first time in a long time, and you see, and in doing so, they are able to build a coalition to push through more stringent, particularly water quality measures, but then also eventually air pollution measures than those Republicans who had dominated the Republican caucus before that had been willing to do, right? And what happens is that in the 70s, in broad terms, again, just in broad terms, you see both in Pennsylvania and on the national level, a viewpoint among Republican leadership that blaming environmental regulation for economic deindustrialization is a way to peel workers away from the Democratic Party. And that is really going to, and to give you a national level figure in that, think about Ronald Reagan, right? So Ronald Reagan is a California governor, right? And he ran for California governor embracing increased role of the state in preventing smog, right? As an environmentalist, right? By the time we get to the 1970s, late 70s and early 80s, Reagan is criticizing the Carter administration for all of these regulations, including environmental regulations that he blames for deindustrialization. And so it becomes kind of the strategy for Republicans to peel away union voters, blue collar voters from the Democrats. Over time, and that has over time sort of gotten more and more polarized with the environmental movement becoming much more associated kind of solely with the Democratic Party, and what we think of as anti-environmentalism associated much more with the Republican Party. That's a very Cliff Notes version, but you know, a relatively accurate one as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, and again, it's tied up with it's tied up with an opposition to the conservation movement. Really emphasizes the economic benefits of government control of resources in a way that kind of appeals to business and appeals to certain elite business interests, right? And the environmental movement, with its emphasis on you might say as in not compromising or being less concerned about natural resources as kind of economic inputs. That is where we kind of really see a divergence of the coalition that we saw in the late 60s and early 70s into the polarized framework of the late 70s. And I will shut up now so we can have other questions, but I really do. I spent a bunch of time in chapter 4 in my book talking about this because it's actually absolutely fascinating sort of to watch that happen. And I'm going to be doing a roundtable at the Pennsylvania Historical Association this year with some of the key environmental lawyers that were hired in the early 70s to create Pennsylvania's kind of environmental regulations. They were called the Environmental Strike Force. And I'm really eager that may very well be my next book, is focusing on the development of this kind of environmental regulations and the ways in which that fractures the coalition that we saw in the late 60s and early 70s. Way longer answer maybe than you wanted, but you can.
No, very interesting.
I've been thinking a lot about this lately.
Thank you again, Alan, for joining us. This is a monumental work that you put together, looking at an awful lot of information, a lot of history, looking at the role of Pennsylvania in environmental history. So thank you again for joining us to share what you've learned in the process of working on this book. We will not have a pastime series in July, so we'll give you the summer off from school. We'll be joined again back in August. I think talking about our Colonel John Jenkins archive, the colonial archive that we've been working to transcribe at the Historical Society. So that'll be our next program. Stay tuned for more information about that. Have a wonderful day, a lovely summer, and happy 4th of July, everybody.